It's a fantastic piece, genuine antique. The latch is tricky, you just have to press right here. Go on, take a look inside. It's worth much more than I'm asking.
$25? That's what they sold it for. A scuffed wooden box on a card table at an estate sale, a strip of blue tape on the lid. The grandson laughed when a quiet man asked about it. That? Just Grandpa's old hunting junk. Take it for 20. The buyer paid 25 and walked to his truck without a word. Nobody there knew what was sealed beneath the false bottom. Not the family stuffing cash in a coffee can, not the neighbours in the garage, not even the 81-year-old man in a care home 4 miles away who had hidden it there 50 years before. Inside that box was the only thing Raymond Doyle had left of his father, and in 9 days it would bring a retired Marine colonel to his door. If something should never have a price tag, type honour in the comments. Raymond Doyle had a way of folding his hands when he sat, right over left, thumb pressing into the old scar at the base of his palm, as if he were holding something in place that nobody else could see. At 81 he was still a tall man, though the years had bent him forward at the shoulders so that he seemed to be perpetually leaning into a wind that wasn't there. He wore the same grey cardigan most days now, the one with the leather buttons gone soft at the edges, and a pair of corrective shoes that made a quiet scuffing sound when he crossed the linoleum of the Cedar Hollow common room. He did not speak much. The aides liked him for it. He never complained, never rang the call button at 3 a.m, never raised his voice at anyone. He thanked them for everything, even the things that didn't go right. What they did not know, what almost nobody alive still knew, was that the faint tremor in his left hand had nothing to do with his age or his medications. It had started in the winter of 1968, on a hill in a country he never named out loud, and it had never fully left him. He had spent the better part of 60 years keeping that hand still by simply holding it with the other one, the way a man holds a door against a wind. He was, in the end, a person built almost entirely out of things he had decided not to say. And the largest of all those silences was a plain wooden box that, until 2 weeks ago, had sat at the bottom of his bedroom closet, under a folded wool blanket, exactly, to the inch, where his father had told him to keep it. He thought about that box now more than he thought about almost anything. He did not yet know it was gone. The house on Calloway Street had been emptied with the brisk efficiency of people who saw it as a chore rather than a farewell. Raymond's fall in March had broken his hip, and in the eyes of his family settled an argument they had been having in low voices for years. The house was too big, the stairs were a hazard, the neighbourhood had changed and the property taxes hadn't, and so, while Raymond was still relearning how to walk with a metal walker down a hallway that smelled of bleach and overcooked vegetables, his son Gary and his grandson Cody set about turning 40 years of a man's life into a single Saturday's transactions. They hired a company to tag the furniture, they rented folding tables, they stapled paper signs to the telephone poles at both ends of the block, "State Sale, everything must go," with a clip-art arrow pointing the wrong direction. Cody, who was 29 and ran a vape shop 2 towns over, kept calling the whole thing Operation Declutter and narrating it on his phone for people who weren't there. He had grown up calling Raymond the old man in a tone that had started out affectionate, and somewhere over the years quietly curdled into something else. Gary told himself they were doing the responsible thing, and most of him believed it. He was 60, exhausted, carrying his father's care and his own bad knees and a marriage that had thinned out, and he had learned long ago to stop asking his father questions, because his father never answered them anyway. What none of them understood, as they carried boxes out into the grey morning, was that one of those boxes held a secret that would, within the week, make every careless word spoken across those card tables impossible to take back. The sale opened at 8 on a damp April morning, and by 9 the driveway was crowded with strangers turning Raymond's life over in their hands. They held his coffee mugs up to the light and set them back down. They flipped through his paperback westerns, the spines all cracked at the same chapters. They haggled over the lawnmower and the good drill and a recliner that still held the shape of him. The estate company woman had priced the obvious things and dumped the rest onto a long table by the garage under a single hand-lettered sign. Make offer. That was where the box ended up, wedged between a bread machine and a coffee can full of mismatched keys. It was maybe 16 inches long, walnut gone dark and honey deep with age, the corners joined in tight hand-cut dovetails that no machine had ever touched. 2 brass hinges had gone green at the seams. A small latch had been worn mirror-smooth by decades of the same thumb. On the lid, Almost sanded away by time and handling, someone had once burned 3 small initials into the grain, TRD. A woman picked it up, turned it over, frowned, set it down. A man lifted the lid, saw an empty interior lined with cracked grey felt, and lost interest in half a second. The estate company woman had nearly dumped it into the 50-cent bin with the chipped flower pots and the orphaned extension cords, then stopped herself at the last moment, not because she saw anything in it, but because the dovetails were too clean, and some instinct from 20 years in the trade told her that hand-joined walnut should never go for 50 cents, even empty. So she set it on the make-offer table instead and promptly forgot it. A teenage boy spun the smooth little latch open and shut a few times because he liked the sound it made, then drifted off toward a milk crate of old video games. An older couple debated it for a moment. The wife thought it might be just the thing for her sewing thread. The husband said they already had 3 boxes doing nothing in the basement, and moved on down the table. By noon, the box had been picked up and set back down more than a dozen times. To every one of them it was a curio, a box for nothing in particular, the kind of thing that sells for a couple of dollars or doesn't sell at all. Not one of them thought to press on the bottom panel. Not one of them noticed that the box was nearly a full inch deeper on the outside than it was on the inside. Every hand that touched it felt only the shallow, empty top and the smooth, worn latch, and every one of them set it down again none the wiser. And the one man in the county who had noticed that, who had run his thumb along that seam and go suddenly completely still, had not yet pulled into the driveway. His name was Marcus Vance, and he restored old furniture in a cluttered workshop behind his house, more as a way to keep his hands occupied than as a living. He was 44, an army veteran who had done 2 tours in Iraq and come home with a back that ached before the rain and a habit of going quiet and watchful in crowds. He went to estate sales on Saturdays the way other men went fishing, not really hunting for anything in particular, just needing somewhere to be on a morning that would otherwise be too long. He saw the walnut box from across the driveway and felt the small, familiar tug he always felt around things that had been made by hand, by someone who had cared how the corners met. He picked it up, he turned it over, and that was when his thumb found the seam along the base, and he tapped the bottom with 2 knuckles and it answered with the wrong sound, a hollow under the hollow, a held breath inside the wood. He looked up to ask the family about it. That was when Cody drifted over, thumb still on his phone, and delivered the line about Grandpa's old hunting junk, and laughed and quoted $20. Marcus paid $25 because the box was worth more than that empty, and because something about the way the kid laughed made him want to be back in his truck. He did not open the false bottom in the driveway. He did not say one word about what he'd heard inside it. He simply carried it to the passenger seat, set it down gently as a sleeping child, and the whole drive home he kept glancing over at it, the way you glance at a stranger you are almost certain you have met somewhere before, and cannot for the life of you place. 4 miles away, Raymond Doyle was sitting by the window in the common room with his hands folded, right over left, thumb resting on the scar. He did not know there was a sale that day. Gary had told him only that they were getting things organised at the house, and Raymond had nodded the way he nodded at most things now, because nodding cost less than asking. But he had been thinking about the box all morning, the way he did most mornings lately. He could close his eyes and feel the exact weight of it across his palms, the cool of the walnut, the precise give of the false panel when you pressed the back left corner and slid it forward along its track. His father had built that box in the winter of 1946, the first winter he was home from the Pacific, in a garage that smelled of sawdust and machine oil and the cold coming off the concrete floor. And he had shown the hiding place to Raymond exactly once, in the spring of 1965, when Raymond was 19 years old and about to ship out himself. His father had not made a speech of it. He had simply opened the panel, let Raymond look at what lay underneath, closed it again with a soft wooden click, and said, in that low voice that never rose, "Some things you don't sell, and you don't explain to people. You just keep them." Then he had pressed the box into his son's hands and walked back into the house and never spoke of it again. Raymond had kept it for 50 years. He had never told Gary what was inside, partly because saying it out loud felt like cheapening it, and partly because some lazy, hopeful part of him had always assumed there would be more time to do it right. The truth was that the box had carried him through more than one bad year. When Raymond had come home from Khe-Sanh in the late summer of 1968, 22 years old, 11 pounds lighter, with the tremor already settled into his hand, and a way of waking at the smallest sound that would never quite leave him. He had not been able to talk about any of it either. He had sat at his father's kitchen table for a week, saying almost nothing, and his father had not pushed. His father had simply gotten up one evening, gone to the closet, taken down the walnut box and set it on the table between them without a word. Raymond had understood. His father was telling him, "I carried mine the same way. You are not the first, and you will not be the last, and there is no shame in needing somewhere to put a thing you cannot say." They had sat there together in the lamplight, 2 Marines from 2 wars, neither of them speaking, and it had been the closest thing to comfort Raymond had felt in months. His father had been gone 11 years now, but Raymond could still hear the soft wooden click of that panel sliding shut, and on the hard nights it was the sound he reached for. He sat by the window now, watching the parking lot, not knowing that the time had already run out that morning, in a driveway, for $25. It was nearly midnight before Marcus finally sat down at his workbench with the box, a clean rag, and a small flashlight. He had not been able to think about anything else all day. He pressed the corners one at a time the way old hiding places taught you to, and on the 4th try, the back left corner gave with a tiny shift, and the whole bottom panel slid forward along a track so finely cut that it startled him. 50 years of grime in the seam, and the wood still moved like water, like the morning it left the maker's hands. Underneath, wrapped in a square of oilcloth gone stiff and yellow as old paper, was a flat object about the size of his palm. He lifted it out and unwrapped it slowly under the lamp. A medal. A bronze 5-pointed star hanging from a ribbon of red and white and blue, the metal gone dark in the recesses, and pinned through the face of the ribbon a small bronze letter V, folded beneath it into careful quarters, gone soft as cloth from being handled and refolded over the decades, was a single sheet of military citation paper, and beneath that a black and white photograph, a young Marine squinting into hard Pacific sunlight, helmet pushed back, a rifle laid across his knees, and a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Marcus, who had worn a uniform himself, knew exactly what he was holding, and he knew with absolute certainty that it did not belong in a $25 box on a stranger's workbench at midnight. He read the name typed across the top of the citation 3 times before it would hold still in his head. Then he set the medal down on the clean rag as carefully as if it might wake, and he sat back, and he did not sleep that night. Somewhere across town, a family was counting the day's cash into a coffee can, and not one of them knew that the most valuable thing they had ever owned had walked out the door that morning in another man's truck. The name typed across the top of the citation was Corporal Thomas R. Doyle. The date was June 1945. The place, in the flat formal language of the document, was a piece of ground on Okinawa the words called Wanna-Draw, and the sentences in between were the kind the military uses to describe the things men do that have no business being possible, at great personal risk with complete disregard for his own safety, under intense and sustained enemy fire. Marcus read it twice more in the grey morning light at his kitchen table, his coffee going cold at his elbow. He spent the better part of the next 2 days on his laptop and on the phone, to a county historical society, to a Marine Corps League detachment 3 counties over, to a soft-spoken man in Ohio who maintained a database of Pacific veterans out of a spare bedroom and answered on the first ring. By the second evening he had a unit, 1st Marine Division, a muster roll, and a thin thread of names from the men who had served alongside Thomas Doyle on that ridge. The man in Ohio had been the one to crack it open. He had pulled the after-action reports for that stretch of the line in the 3rd week of May and the 1st week of June 1945, and read them aloud over the phone in a slow, reverent voice, and Marcus had sat with the legal pad filling page after page. Wanna-Draw and Wanna-Ridge had been some of the worst ground of the whole campaign, a network of caves and reverse slope positions where the 1st Marine Division had fought for every yard in driving rain that turned the red clay to a glue that swallowed boots and stretchers alike. The casualty figures the Ohio man read off were the kind that made Marcus set down his pen, and in among the typed sheets was the corroborating record, a Corporal T.R. Doyle, recommended for the Bronze Star with Combat Distinguishing Device, for repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire to recover wounded Marines from an untenable position. The citation in Marcus's hands and the report on the Ohio man's desk lined up name for name, date for date. It was real. It had all been real, and it had been folded in the dark of a homemade box at the bottom of a closet, and a kid had laughed and sold it for the price of a tank of gas. And one of those names, when Marcus typed it into the search bar, returned something that made him sit up straight. A recent local newspaper photo of a man in a dress uniform heavy with ribbons, standing very erect at a Memorial Day ceremony. Retired Colonel Harlan Briggs, United States Marine Corps, 83 years old. The caption said the colonel spoke at the same monument every single year, and that he always told the same story, about his father, a Marine private who had been pinned down and bleeding on a ridge on Okinawa in the spring of 1945, and about the corporal who had crawled out under machine gun fire to drag him back, a corporal whose family the colonel had been trying to find for 60 years and had never given up on. Marcus set down his coffee. He picked up his phone. He did not call the family on Calloway Street. He called the number listed for the colonel. 2 days later, Marcus drove out to the house on Calloway Street to do the right thing the simple way. Find the family, return the medal, be done with it. The sale was long over. A faded real estate sign had gone up crooked in the front yard. He knocked, and it was Cody who answered, phone in hand, and Gary who came up behind him wiping his palms on his jeans. Marcus explained who he was and what he had found, and he held the wrapped medal out in both hands, the way you carry something you're afraid of dropping. And the thing that happened next was the thing he would never quite be able to explain to anyone afterward. Cody shrugged. Gary frowned, looked at the bundle, looked vaguely uncomfortable and said, well, I mean, we didn't know that was in there, but you bought the box fair and square, so... He did not reach for it. He kept his hands at his sides, and Cody, glancing back down at his phone, actually said, honestly, dude, it's just an old medal. You keep it. We're trying to clear all this out, not bring more of it back. Marcus stood there on the porch with a man's bronze star in his open hands, being told to keep it because giving it back was inconvenient, and he felt something cold and slow move down through his chest. He had carried men himself once, in another desert in another decade, and he knew the exact weight of the thing in his hands, not the few ounces of bronze, but the years it stood in for, the nights, the names a man like Thomas Doyle would have carried to his grave without speaking. There was a folded flag in a cabinet in Marcus's own house that he still could not look at straight on, a friend who hadn't come back, and the idea of handing a thing like that to a stranger and hearing keep it. Dude, it's just an old medal was something he physically could not make himself do. He asked quietly whether the man who'd earned it was still living. Gary said no. His grandfather, the one in the photo, had passed back in 79. But his own father, Raymond, was still alive, in a care home over on the east side, a place called Cedar Hollow. Marcus thanked them and walked back to his truck, and he did not keep the medal, and he did not mail it back either. Because he understood now that quietly returning it would not be enough, not for what it was, and because in 48 hours a colonel was already driving 400 miles toward that care home, and what that old man had to say was not going to be said quietly. Marcus could have stopped there. He had found the family. The family didn't want it. Legally, the box and everything in it were his, but he had spent 2 tours of his own learning exactly what it cost to leave a man behind, and he could not make himself do it now, over a piece of bronze and a folded page, so he made a second round of calls. He learned from the home's director that the family had one last visit to Cedar Hollow scheduled for that Friday. Gary and Cody were going to bring Raymond a banker's box of personal items they'd set aside, to make the clear-out feel a little less like an abandonment, and to have him sign some final papers about the sale of the house. Marcus arranged through the director to be there. He did not tell Gary, and he certainly did not tell the family that Colonel Harlan Briggs, United States Marine Corps retired, would be there too. When Marcus had finally reached the colonel by phone and finished the whole story, there had been a long silence on the line, and then the old man had said only, "Say that name to me again." Marcus said it. Thomas R. Doyle, won a draw, June of 45. There was a quiet on the other end so long that Marcus thought the call had dropped, until he heard the old colonel breathing, and then Briggs said, in a voice that had gone thick and unsteady, "Son, I have been looking for that man's family since before you were born." He told Marcus then the thing he had carried his whole life. His father, Eugene, had come home from the Pacific and lived another 51 years on legs that ached every cold morning, and not a single one of those mornings had passed without the old man saying, in one form or another, that he owed every step he took to a corporal whose face he had only seen once, upside down, in the half-second before he passed out from blood loss. Eugene Briggs had named his only son after no one in particular, But he had raised that son on the story of the man in the mud, until Harlan had grown up and put on the same uniform and spent a 30-year career and then a 20-year retirement, quietly trying to find out who that corporal had been and whether he had any people left. He had written letters. He had haunted reunions of a division whose ranks thinned every year. He had very nearly given up. "I am 83 years old," the colonel said. "I have buried almost everyone. I had stopped believing I would ever get to say thank you to anybody who shared that man's blood. And now you are telling me his son is alive, 400 miles from my door, and he said he was coming, and that nothing on God's earth was going to stop him." And Marcus heard, faintly, the sound of a closet opening and a uniform being taken down. Meanwhile, on Calloway Street, Cody was telling his friends the whole thing was a hassle. Some random guy showing up trying to hand back a piece of junk, his grandfather's old war stuff, just one more pile of clutter in a house that had been full of clutter. He had no idea that within 72 hours he would be standing in a room, in front of a colonel and a stranger and his own grandfather, wishing he could reach back through time and unsay every word of it. Friday came in grey and damp, the kind of low spring sky that doesn't lift. The Cedar Hollow common room had been cleared of its usual card games, and the director had quietly set out 2 rows of folding chairs, without explaining to anyone why. Raymond Doyle was wheeled in at 2 o'clock, hands folded right over left, expecting nothing more from the afternoon than his son's awkward small talk and a few papers to sign. Gary came in carrying the banker's box of odds and ends, a couple of photo frames, a chipped coffee mug, 2 of the paperback westerns, the curated too-late apology of a man who had sold everything else his father owned. Cody trailed behind him, thumbs already moving across his phone. They were halfway through the strained pleasantries when the double doors at the end of the room swung open, and Marcus Vance walked in, and behind him, slowly, leaning on a polished cane but with his spine straight as a flagstaff, came an old man in a dark, perfectly pressed suit with a single, small device pinned to the lapel and the unmistakable bearing of a man who had spent his life giving orders that were obeyed without question. The whole room seemed to draw a breath. Gary half rose, confused. Cody looked up from his phone for the first time in an hour, and Raymond Doyle, who had not stood on his own in weeks, planted both hands flat on the arms of his wheelchair and began, with enormous and visible effort, to push himself up onto his feet. Because something in the old colonel's eyes, across 30 feet of folding chairs, had already told him exactly who this stranger was and exactly why he had come. Marcus stepped forward and set a small wrapped bundle on the table between them. The colonel looked at Raymond for a long, silent moment. Then he turned and looked at Gary and at Cody, and he said, in a voice that did not need to be raised to fill the room, "Do either of you have the faintest idea who this man's father was?" Nobody answered. The colonel let the silence do its work, the way a man does who has spent a lifetime understanding that the most important things are usually said in the pause before the words. Then he reached into his jacket and drew out a photograph of his own, creased, soft at the corners, a young soldier propped up grinning in a hospital bed. And he laid it on the table beside the wrapped bundle, and he began to talk. His father, he said, was Private First Class Eugene Briggs, 19 years old in the spring of 1945, a rifleman in a marine company on Okinawa. On a ridge above a place the maps called Wanna Draw, his platoon had been caught in the open by interlocking machine gun fire from a fortified Japanese position, and Eugene Briggs had taken rounds through both legs and gone down hard in a shallow shell crater with 2 other wounded Marines. In ground the corpsmen could not reach without dying themselves. It had been raining for 3 days, the colonel said, the kind of rain that turned the whole island to red soup, and the wounded men had lain in 6 inches of bloody water listening to the rounds crack the air a hand's width above the lip of the crater, certain each of them that this was the place they would die. They lay out there through most of an afternoon. And then, the colonel said, his voice slowing and dropping until the whole room leaned in to catch it, a corporal from a different squad, a quiet kid from a Pennsylvania steel town who barely spoke above a murmur and never once volunteered for anything, had refused a direct order to wait for dark. He had stripped off his pack, handed his rifle to the man beside him, told him to hold it, and crawled out over the lip into 40 yards of open, fire-swept mud. Not once, 3 separate times. He went out flat on his belly with his face in the muck, and he hooked his fist into the collar of each wounded man's dungaree jacket, and he dragged him back inch by inch, while the ground jumped and spat all around him. On the 3rd trip, going back for Eugene, the last man, the heaviest. A round punched through his shoulder and spun him half around, and he lay still for a moment, and every man watching was sure he was finished. And then he kept crawling. He got Eugene Briggs over the lip and into the hands of a corpsman, and then, bleeding from the shoulder, he simply turned around and crawled back to his own squad and picked his rifle back up. And when a sergeant asked his name, he would not give it. The colonel unfolded the citation from the bundle on the table, and his hand was not entirely steady now, and he read aloud in the hush of that ordinary room the words that had lain folded in the dark of a wooden box for 50 years, the flat, formal sentences about a Marine who, with complete disregard for his own safety and under intense and sustained enemy fire, had voluntarily and repeatedly crossed fire-swept terrain to evacuate 3 gravely wounded comrades, his actions reflecting the highest traditions of the naval service. When he finished, he set the paper down gently and he looked up and he said, "That corporal was your grandfather's father. The man whose legs he saved was mine. I am alive and I learned to walk, and I had a father at all because Thomas Doyle would not leave Eugene Briggs in that crater. I have been trying to find this family my entire adult life." Then he turned, slowly, and he looked directly at Cody, and he said very quietly, "And you sold his medal in a driveway for $25. The word for what filled that room is not embarrassment. It is something older and far heavier than that." Cody had gone the colour of paper. He had put his phone away without anyone telling him to, and his hands hung useless at his sides, as though he no longer remembered what they were for. Gary was staring at the creased photograph of the grinning soldier in the hospital bed, and his mouth was working, and no sound at all was coming out of it. But it was Raymond who held the room without trying to. Raymond had gotten all the way up onto his feet, swaying, gripping the edge of the table with both hands, and the tears were running down the deep weathered lines of his face and dropping off his jaw onto the linoleum, and he was nodding, slowly, steadily, the way a man nods when a thing he has carried entirely alone for half a century is finally, mercifully, being lifted and carried by someone else too. The colonel crossed the room to him, unhurried, his cane tapping the floor twice, and then this 83-year-old retired Marine colonel drew himself up to his full height in front of an 81-year-old man in a soft grey cardigan, and he raised his right hand in a slow, deliberate textbook salute, not to Raymond's rank, because Raymond had been a corporal too, an ordinary one, a caisson corporal who had come home in 1968 and put it all in a box, but to the blood he carried, and to the man who had built that box, and to the silence both Doyle men had kept so faithfully and so long that it had very nearly been thrown out with the kitchen mugs. Raymond lifted his trembling left hand and returned it, and for the full length of that salute, held there in the middle of an ordinary care home afternoon, the tremor in his hand was completely, perfectly gone. The aide by the door had stopped breathing. The director was crying without bothering to hide it, and Gary, 60 years old, a man who had spent his whole life believing his father was simply a quiet, closed-off man with nothing much to say, sat down hard in a folding chair as though his legs had gone out from under him, because he was understanding all at once and far too late that the silence he had resented his entire life had not been emptiness. It had been a full thing, a heavy thing, a thing his father had been carrying alone so that no one else would have to. When the colonel finally lowered his hand, he took Raymond's in both of his own and held it, and the two old men stood there a long moment, foreheads nearly touching, saying nothing, because between men like them the saying had already been done 60 years before on a ridge in the rain by a corporal who would not stay down. In the days that followed, the apologies came, though they came differently from each man who owed one. Gary's came stumbling and red-faced and unfinished, the apology of a man realizing far too late that he had spent his entire life never once asking his father the single question that actually mattered, and that the answer had been sitting in a closet under a blanket the whole time, waiting to be asked for. He sat with Raymond for 2 hours that week, and, for the first time either of them could remember, his father talked, and Gary only listened. He learned more about the man in those 2 hours than he had in the 60 years before them, and he wept twice, and Raymond pretended not to notice, which was its own quiet kind of mercy. Cody's apology came later, and alone, after he had driven home and sat in his parked car in the dark for the better part of an hour with his hands on the wheel. It came in the form of a quiet message to Marcus Vance asking, simply, how a person was supposed to make something like this right. Marcus told him the truth, the only truth he had, that you cannot unsell a thing, and you cannot crawl back across the years and unsay it. But you can decide, starting now, what you do next. The medal itself never went back into the bottom of a closet. Raymond and the Colonel sat together and agreed that Thomas Doyle's bronze star, his citation, the squinting photograph, and the very box his own hands had built in 1946 would all go on permanent loan to the small Marine Corps museum the Colonel had spent his retirement helping to build, displayed in a single case bearing both their fathers' names, the corporal who crawled and the private he refused to leave behind. Marcus drove Raymond there himself 3 weeks later, the old man riding in the passenger seat where the wooden box had once ridden. The museum had made an afternoon of it. Word had travelled, the way these stories do, and there were perhaps 40 people in the small gallery when they unveiled the case. A few ageing Marines from the Colonel's old reunion circle, a reporter from the county paper, the soft-spoken man from Ohio who had driven in for the occasion, and shook Raymond's hand without quite being able to speak. The case held the bronze star and its ribbon, the folded citation now flattened and framed, the squinting photograph of the young corporal in the hard sunlight, and the walnut box itself lid open, the false bottom slid back to show the empty hiding place it had guarded for half a century. The Colonel said a few words, so to everyone's surprise did Gary, only 3 sentences, and his voice broke on the second one, but he got them out. Raymond himself did not speak at the podium. He simply walked up to the glass at the end, on Marcus's arm, and pressed his fingertips to the cool surface over the place where his father's medal lay, and he stood there a long time with his head bowed, and the whole room let him. But the thing none of them had thought to brace him for was waiting back at Cedar Hollow when he returned, because Cody had spent those 3 weeks doing something quietly, something nobody had asked him to do, and it was sitting on his great-grandfather's son's bed. What Cody had done was this: unable to sleep, eaten alive by a shame he had never felt before in his life, he had gone back through every photograph and every carton from the house clear out, every box of junk he had so nearly hauled straight to the dump, and he had begun, clumsily at first and then with real care, to assemble the history he had spent his whole life refusing to look at. He found Raymond's own service record. He found a faded unit photograph from Khe Sanh, 1968, a much younger Raymond standing lean and hollow-eyed in the back row among the 26th Marines. He found discharge papers and commendations Raymond had never once hung on a wall. He found a thin bundle of letters Thomas Doyle had written home from the Pacific in a careful, looping schoolboy hand, the paper soft as moth wings, and Cody had taken every piece of it to a frame shop and worked with the owner for the better part of 2 weeks to build a single large shadow box. 3 generations of one family, 2 wars, a father and a son, and the quiet inheritance that ran between them like a current under still water. And he had hung it on the wall of Raymond's room so that the very first thing the old man would see when he came home from the museum was proof that none of it, in the end, had been thrown away. He had done more than that too, though he never said so out loud. He had driven to the Historical Society and sat with the volunteers and learned to read a service record. He had called the man in Ohio and listened to the whole story of Wanadror a second time, taking notes he would keep. He had started that month to visit Cedar Hollow on Wednesdays, not because anyone asked him to, but because he had discovered there was a man sitting by a window with 81 years of things nobody had ever bothered to ask him about, and a grandson who had spent 29 years not asking. Cody was waiting in the room when the aide wheeled Raymond in. He could not get a single word out. He just lifted one hand and pointed at the wall, and Raymond looked at it for a long, long time. The 2 young Marines 60 years apart, the looping schoolboy letters home, the empty velvet square in the corner with the small card explaining that the original medal now lived behind museum glass 4 states away. And then he reached out and took his grandson's hand in both of his own, right over left, thumb on the scar, and he held it. And that was the whole of the apology, made and accepted, without a single word spoken between them, the way the Doyle men had always done everything that mattered most. Raymond Doyle still sits by the window in the Cedar Hollow common room most afternoons, hands folded, right over left, thumb resting on the old scar. But the aides will tell you he talks a little more now than he used to. Sometimes a younger resident or a visiting school group or a new nurse on her first week will stop and ask about the big frame on his wall, the shadow box with the 2 young Marines 60 years apart, and the small velvet square in the corner where a card explains that the medal itself now lives behind museum glass in another state. And Raymond will tell them, in his slow and quiet way, about a father who built a box to hold the things you do not sell and do not explain, and a stranger who paid $25 and could so easily have kept it all, and instead drove 400 miles worth of phone calls to give it back, and a colonel who learned to walk as a boy only because a corporal he never met would not leave his father bleeding in the mud. The lesson Raymond leaves them with is always the same, and he never preaches it, because he earned the right to say it the hardest way a man can. The true worth of a person, or a life, or a battered old wooden box is almost never written on the tag hanging off the front of it. You have to know what's underneath. So before you laugh at the quiet old man in the cardigan, before you call someone else's whole life a pile of junk, stop for one moment and ask yourself what silence might be holding. If this story moved you, subscribe and stay with us. Every week we tell the stories of the ones the world looked right past. Type honor in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.